Camille, thanks for joining us. Why don't you give us just a quick intro? Let folks know who you are.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on, Jeff. So, I have been an engineer, software engineer for over a decade now. It's been way too long, but a lot of fun. And over the last 6 years in particular, I have been working mostly in DevX and also on open source. So, I've been working with most recently the Apollo MCP Server, Rover CLI, for those who are aware of it. And before then, I was also working previous job at Circle CI, working on these CI/CD pipelines that many of you may or may not enjoy at the moment. So, yeah, I've been having a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining, and we'll get right into it. So, as you acknowledged, you're working at Apollo right now, and things like that. I know in the past at Apollo too, you've done work on Rover, our command line utility, and you've also done a lot of UI work in your career, as I understand it. So, what might surprise, your average web and mobile developer about working with a TUI?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I think the thing that surprised me when I transitioned into working on Rover was the amount of consideration that's necessary for a really great developer experience. Um, Again, I am really design focused and user focused, so it was really like a really pleasant surprise to learn about, and some people might know about this, but the very famous command line interface guidelines website. I think it's SLIG, that's how I pronounce it, but clig.dev, um, which are just the common and de facto patterns that one is supposed to kind of follow when working on a CLI. Um, so I found that really interesting that I could transfer my experience in focusing on a really great customer experience, this in this case for developers and engineers, um, from something that was visual to something that was in code or in the terminal. So that was really fun. And it still continued to spark that thread of connecting with the customer and connecting with the user that I really enjoy. So um, I think that was the biggest surprise for me.
Huh. I mean,
Yeah,
one of the things about that I find fascinating about, and I'm a person who likes to live in the terminal wherever I can,
yeah.
but I think one of the things that, and to be fair, like I hadn't really worked on any significant terminal experiences. I mean, I've made terminal utilities, but they're fairly scoped, like input, output, and that's it. But it always struck me as somewhat of a one-dimensional medium, and I say that with love, like the idea of like, you know, just text rolling by, and that is that sort of how you see it, or is there nuance to that that I'm leaving out?
Ooh, that's a really good question too. And I'd love to get more, I'd love to get deeper into what you'd like to know because I think there are a lot of dimensions to what you can do with a CLI and to its power that um, might kind of answer your question.
Hmm.
For example, yes, there is this idea of text in, text out, but the fact of the matter is that you can, of course, simply do so much more nowadays um, with the CLIs that are much more than text in, text out. The ability to, for example, run your own deploys, an entire workflow through the CLI is so much richer than what I came in with, 10 years ago. Um, I think that's kind of what you're getting at is yes, there might have been this kind of text in, text out past, but with the need and the necessity of having these kind of like serverless architectures that are much more complex, that need a lot more infrastructure, these are things that we've just kind of like off-boarded onto CLI. And I think for our benefit in many ways. Um, and as the user experience gets clearer and better and easier, I think of Supabase when I think of when I think of that really easy deployment experience. Um,
Hmm.
I think it's just going to become easier and richer to be able to provide more powerful experiences. Um,
Yeah, that makes sense. Like,
yeah.
I mean, when I think of a a terminal interface, especially if there's like an analogous kind of web or application interface, the word that comes to mind is maybe simplicity or clarity. Maybe there's just fewer levers to pull in the terminal, and that can be maybe clarifying for the end user. I use Claude a fair amount and Claude Code in the terminal, and one of the things that they shipped recently was when the model asks you a question, it constrains your input now. So it's no longer a free
Mhm.
text field. They'll say like they'll do the whole 1, 2, 3 thing. And another, in the past I would have typed out one and said why, but now it's like a, select, it's like a select and I press the arrow keys until I find the one I want. And then they'll offer you that free text. But I thought that was a nice, like, sort of middle ground between sort of the constraints that maybe a more uh, traditional interface, traditional, I guess what's old is new again, a more
Yeah,
like application-based interface gives you versus like a
yeah,
text input.
yeah. I think there's that idea of statefulness
Hmm.
that is much that is that I think we're starting to embrace a lot more in CLI development or in CLI design. And I think, things like MCP and client and agentic clients necessitate that. Um, so there is
Hmm.
this need for like more complex tasks and more complex workflows to exist and persist in CLIs, and we're starting to see that movement that the steps that we would experience in a desktop or a GUI, we're starting to see in the CLI, and there's something a little bit what feels like, and people might argue this, but I feel it feels like there's less friction when you're, at least for me, when I'm dealing with that, with like a problem that requires many tasks or has multiple states in the CLI. And maybe that's just my brain, but I do find that linearity that
Hmm.
is like kind of forced on you in a CLI to be much easier to grok. And it forces me to break down my tasks in a different way. Whereas sometimes with a GUI, you kind of get everything at once. And the challenge is trying to parse what you need at the very time that you need it. So in some ways, I really enjoy that funnel that occurs with CLIs. Uh, some people don't, but I definitely do for that reason.
Huh. The example that comes to mind as you say that is like an experience like Rover Init.
Hmm.
Rover Init, for folks who might not be aware, is this experience where you run that command and it'll help you get started building, a federated graph and things like that. And it gives you, a set of constraints and kind of leads you down, hopefully, the path to success there. And I'm imagining that experience in a browser. And I think, and we do have that, I suppose, but the browser does require you to go back and forth anyway with the command line anyway, because it needs system access. So I think that's an example that comes to mind that's sort of like if you have a defined workflow that's step by step and needs you to do things on your computer, maybe the TUI is the right form factor. Is that what I'm hearing?
I can't say that for everything, but for many
Hmm.
things that I have to provision or scaffold, I found it to be much easier to do in the CLI rather than in the GUI. But I'm happy to be proven wrong there, always.
Any like favorite features you've worked on in the CLI space in Rover or any other CLI you've worked on?
Oh gosh. Funny that you bring up Rover Knit because that was a lot of fun, particularly the onboarding Rover Knit for MCP for our MCP server. Um, That was a really interesting project. I'd been maybe a few months or so into working in with Rust, um, and having to build a state machine um, in Rust was just an incredible amount of fun. Um, And so I just really was able to kind of run free and build something that I'd never kind of built before, with constraints that felt um, safe. If you know anything about the type state pattern in Rust, um, it allows for that level of safety on the not just the type level, but also um, just in its design. So I found that really fun.
Oh, it's
So it was the
cool.
code that was fun.
Rust state machines, love it.
Yes.
Um, so like you mentioned MCP in this context a little bit, and I'd love to pull on that thread. Is at least from my point of view, and maybe I'm oversimplifying things, but I see like terminal or command line utilities and MCP is sort of cousins in that their primary duty, as I see it, is they're working on delivering text to and from the
Mm,
user. And I know you've been working a lot on Apollo MCP Server, and one of my biggest knowledge gaps is around like auth.
mm.
And how do you see like the practice of limiting MCP tool access to only the folks who should have it? Like, what should folks know about that?
So that's a good question too, and it kind of depends because there's a few levels to the question that you're asking,
Hmm.
which is really fascinating and also makes OAuth, or let's call it authn and auth authentication and authorization, really intimidating. So in order to break it down, when your agentic client is messaging or calling your MCP server, there's three levels that you kind of want to think about. Um, One is who's calling, so your agentic client. That's authorization. You also want to think about what can they invoke or access? When do you say yes or when do you say no to them? And then you also want to think about, especially in the GraphQL space, which is very cool. And I think rather, we do this rather well. What you return, which is kind of like field level access. Um, so those are, if you're really thinking and you're really overwhelmed, break it down in that way. That's like the first way to do it. So the first gate is your client is calling your MCP server and you want to make sure that it's allowed to call that MCP server. That's where authorization comes in, or authentication,
Hmm.
I should say. And that's just your standard OAuth flow. Apollo MCP server, on that note, follows OAuth 2.1. So you've probably seen this already, but when you go to a website or even to Cloud Code and you're not logged in, you're taken to, say, GitHub or something else to validate you are who you say you are. That's the OAuth flow. Let's just say
Hmm.
it simply. So that's the first thing that you want to think about. You want to make sure that you validate and verify who's calling your server. The second thing that you want to think about is, okay, once you've validated that they can in fact call your server, um, what do you allow them to call? And this is where Apollo MCP server is rather powerful because there's two ways in which you can gate what they can have access to. So the first is like global level scopes, and that's where, if you know, in Apollo MCP server, GraphQL operations get converted directly one-to-one into tools and MCP, and you can define which tools are allowed um, to be accessed by an
Hmm.
agent. So that would be the second level. Once they've gone through the gate, they are who they say they are. Now they can get tool A and tool B, but not tool C. And then finally, the thing that's actually pretty cool that we don't talk about that much in Apollo MCP server because it's more of a router feature for federated graphs is the idea of enforcing access on the field level. So now they have a tool that they're able to access, but maybe there's specific fields, maybe in that particular tool or that operation, they shouldn't be able to get private information.
Hmm.
And you're able to, on the router level, use what are called directives in order to restrict what is actually returned. So from the Apollo MCP server focus, there's like a pretty robust um, kind of ecosystem in thinking about OAuth, and not just OAuth, but like authorization as well, which is pretty cool. Hopefully that helps. It's a
It
long-winded way to say
does.
it's a lot.
Well, no, I mean, like to me, like one of the biggest, and I think to many people, one of the biggest leaps of, well, what could be seen as a leap of faith, right, is giving an agent access to sensitive data, right? And my intention behind the question was, well, it's great to know all this stuff about Apollo MCP Server, obviously, but I think the broader point of, there is a disciplined way to constrain access here, it sounds like, through um, you know, if you're using a defined protocol like MCP, for example, to govern access, it sounds like there is pretty much a paved path there. Just repeating it back, like we want to figure out who's calling, figure out what they can call, and then constrain it from there, especially down to field level, which depending on what tech you're using, GraphQL, for example, very great for field level granularity, and you can tighten the screws from there.
Yeah.
Got a completely unrelated question now. If you weren't in software, what would you be doing?
Oh, I would be a I would be writing graphic novels.
Graphic novels. Okay.
Yes, I absolutely would be. Before I was an engineer, I had many lives, and one of those lives was training to be an illustrator. And I went to school a long time ago at university initially with a degree in screenwriting. And I think I would go back to that if I could. If I had all the money in the world and never had to work, I would definitely do that.
I love it. Any projects that kind of like I don't want you to give it away. Don't give us your best idea. What's the third best
No.
idea you've had for a graphic novel?
Wait until the graphic novel comes out.
Got it. Okay. We'll hear about it in the New York Times eventually. That is so cool. Well, Camille, this was a great chat. Thanks for joining us today and sharing your wisdom about terminal interfaces and the art of MCP and access control. We will be back with another chat soon enough. We're going to get into different aspects of software engineering. So. Yeah, thanks again for coming in and sharing your brain with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeff.